This is the Coretex Athletic Review. I'm your host, Evan Carrillo, and each week I dive into the research to distill and relate sports science and psychological peer-reviewed literature to modern-day coaching and athletic development, with a slight bias to hockey goaltenders. Think classic American Western movies, Unforgiven, Tombstone, Open Range, so on. In that genre, one of the most famous actors people might generally think of might be someone like John Wayne. John Wayne starred in over 170 movies across 50 years, known for his roles in American Westerns and war movies. But like a lot of actors, John Wayne wasn't actually his real name. The actor we know as John Wayne was actually Marion Morrison. Still a cool name in my opinion, but maybe carried a little bit less punch than a classic American John Wayne. In fact, Fox studio executives believed Marion Morrison wasn't masculine or American enough for someone with a lead role in the then upcoming 1929 film, The Big Trail, that he was cast for. Before Morrison, or Wayne, was an actor, he had a previous life as an offensive tackle for the University of Southern California. He may have kept playing after his sophomore year, but the story goes he suffered a shoulder injury while surfing, so he ended up walking away from football as he felt his career was now limited due to his injury. At the time, he was reportedly on a football scholarship that covered the full year's tuition plus one meal a day for the total amount of $280 per year. Financial aid at that time was notably frugal, but Morrison did receive some help from USC Athletics. This financial help took a bit of a different form than modern NCAA financial infrastructure. In addition to athletic scholarships, he was just given part-time jobs in addition to his playing and course load as a way to go ahead and earn some more money if you need it. It was actually a part-time job he had at a movie studio, working as a custodian of all things, that led to his big break to enter into the acting world. Likewise, whatever financial aid he received from USC was under the jurisdiction of his coach and could be revoked at any time at the coach's discretion. Now, I admit there's a small, perhaps old school, maybe purist part of me that enjoys the idea of someone working for their money. Although I will acknowledge that money earned from a part-time job in the 1920s had a little bit more purchasing power in the university world than it does today. Like that same $280 for a full year's tuition might get you a single textbook today. That part-time job one might work while competing at the university level, plus managing a full course load probably doesn't go nearly as far as it did in the 1920s. I can just see the people now who are going to say, yeah, well, I work 2 full-time jobs while raising my 4 younger siblings and taking 9 classes a semester and running my dad's company at night, all without any help from anyone. And while admirable and no doubt a Herculean effort with Jocko Willink level discipline, and in some cases maybe even required, for most, there are more efficient ways to operate and direct someone's limited bandwidth. On the flip side, there may be a bit of a shift for the college athlete to, I'll come here if you pay me more than the other school will, in addition to covering every last one of my costs, is probably drifting further away from the spirit of amateur level competition that was both sustainable and best for the sport. Enough of my own opinion though, let's get to the paper. The article this week isn't about new findings in the latest research or a meta-analysis covering a topic that spans decades of research. Rather than presenting new experimental research or a meta-analysis, this paper traces the long history of compensation and commercialization in American college sports. The article this week is a 2026 historical context paper called Compensation for College Athletes, the American Saga of Commercialization in Intercollegiate Sports, written by John Robert Thelen and Eric A. Moyen, published in the Journal of Policy History in 2026. It's a comprehensive review of the history of the spirit of collegiate athletics, especially with regards to professional athletes, and how the funding model of the NCAA has sort of changed over the years and morphed into something that we know today, where we even see stories of some NCAA athletes earning several $100,000 a year to play. Sort of answers the question of how is it that they're getting paid and where's that money coming from? The paper lays it all out in sort of a timeline. Let's go all the way back to the early era and the amateur ideals. This spans from about 1900 to 1930. Early intercollegiate athletics in the United States were framed around more amateur ideals. Some of the key cultural beliefs are things like college sport is meant to build character, discipline, and leadership. Athletes were students first and competitors second, and participation was more for a love of the game, and financial reward just wasn't part of that picture. The college athlete became a symbolic figure in American culture. The authors note in the article that about a century ago, the college athlete was viewed really as a national hero figure, admired not only for athletic success, but also for representing educational institutions and moral virtues. This identity helped reinforce the belief that college athletics were fundamentally different than professional sport. Universities started to begin using sports for institutional prestige. Even in this early era, universities started to recognize that athletics could serve broader institutional goals. Athletic success helped things like increase the school visibility, put them on the map, build institutional reputation and pride, serve to attract students, and then strengthen alumni loyalty. Although athletics were not formally part of the academic mission, they often became the most visible public representation of the university. This was one of the earliest examples of athletics functioning as institutional branding, even before the modern marketing structures existed. Because remember, we're still talking in the early 1900s. While amateur ideals were emphasized publicly, commercial elements were already kind of starting to pop up. Major games are drawing huge paying crowds. Stadium construction is expanding rapidly. They're going from stadiums of 10,000 people to 40, even 100,000 people already early on. Game programs are starting to include advertising, and the newspapers were really starting to promote their college sports. A 1925 profile of college sport programs showed that many features of modern commercialization were already present at this time, though they were less coordinated than they would become later. This coordination bit is actually sort of an important nuance in the paper because commercialization wasn't something that just suddenly appeared. It was already slowly starting to develop in these fragmented and really inconsistent across the different institutions. We might be tempted to think that these early athletes were just playing purely for the love of the game and that there was no compensation in any kind of form, but that's just not true. The authors emphasize that although the early athletes were not always purely unpaid, financial assistance included a couple of different forms like athletic scholarships and even campus jobs arranged by athletic departments, stuff like travel support, housing assistance, and other forms of really informal support. These arrangements were often pretty loosely regulated and varied widely between these institutions. So, in other words, financial benefits existed, but they were often really informal or indirect and never really openly acknowledged. This started to create a pattern that would persist for decades down the road. Athletes were still technically amateurs, but the system is still finding a way to support them financially. The paper transitions into this section called the American Dilemma. The authors describe this as a fundamental tension that begins during this earlier period and continues throughout the history of college athletes. On the one side, universities promote athletics as an educational and amateur activity, but on the other, These same athletics were becoming super highly visible and a really big public spectacle within the towns and cities that they're being hosted in. And people are starting to notice there's a lot of commercial value here. The article refers to this as an enduring American dilemma in intercollegiate athletics. And it's essentially that college sports are supposed to serve academic and developmental purposes, but the popularity and revenue potential of these sports constantly push them toward this commercial entertainment. We've hit the 1930s and now we're in between the zone from 1930 to 1950. This is what the authors call the quiet compensation era. Financial support for athletes becomes a little bit more structured. Between the 30s and 40s, universities were beginning to formalize ways of financially supporting athletes. Scholarships were becoming more common during this period, and they usually covered tuition, of course, sometimes room and board, and occasionally meals or small stipends. But the structure of these scholarships was still very different from the modern financial aid systems that we see today. The scholarships were controlled directly by the team coaches and not by any sort of university administration. That's a lot of power to give to a coach, and it meant that they could not only grant a scholarship, they could reduce it, or they could just revoke it entirely. Another form of financial support during this era was campus employment, and this was usually arranged through the athletic programs. Athletes were frequently given jobs like campus maintenance, library work, stadium or facility work, which would actually be a pretty cool job, I think, or other positions connected to things like alumni businesses. These jobs served an important purpose, which allowed universities to maintain the appearance of amateurism while still helping the athletes earn some money. This practice became widespread across many programs, and enter the John Wayne example. Another development during this era was the increasing role of boosters and alumni supporters. What are those? Boosters often support the athletes through job opportunities, housing arrangements, financial assistance through local businesses, stuff like that. These arrangements were often informal, and because so, they were very difficult to regulate. As a result, universities and conferences began to worry about competitive imbalance between these programs. If you have a big powerhouse school that's got a big booster community, they're able to offer a lot more, and it's just unregulated. The smaller schools just can't compete. There were some early attempts at regulation. Because of the uneven ways athletes were being supported between the schools, universities began discussing the need for rules governing financial aid in college athletics. This led to early efforts to regulate the scholarships, the employment arrangements, and the other athlete benefits. But enforcement during this period was still pretty inconsistent and still tough to regulate. Rules existed, but they were not always applied uniformly, and in many cases, schools simply just found new ways to provide benefits while technically staying within the rules. This pattern, rules followed by the workarounds, started to become a recurring theme in college athletic governance. Despite these growing forms of financial support, the official narrative of amateurism still remained unchanged when looking at college athletes. Universities continued to present college athletics as educational experiences and character building activities, and just fundamentally different from pro sports. This started to create a widening gap between the idealized image of amateur competition and the practical realities of recruiting and supporting athletes. The authors of this paper emphasize that this tension between ideals and practices continued to shape policy decision in college sports for quite some time. This brings us to about the end of the 1940s. Athletes were receiving structured financial support, and schools were competing for talent. Likewise, governing bodies were attempting to regulate the benefits, but the financial scale of college athletics was still relatively modest. The next transformation that would come along would be in the 50s and 60s, and that would change everything dramatically. We're talking about when television starts to enter the picture. By the 1950s now, television began transforming how Americans were consuming sports. College football and basketball obviously were the two big ones, and they were no longer just local events attended by students and alumni and local people that happened to live near the stadium. Television allowed games to reach a national audience, dramatically increasing exposure for universities and their athletic programs. The NCAA, I think, recognized that they were sitting on an untapped oil reserve here. They saw this potential early and moved to centralize control of television broadcasting. Rather than allowing individual schools to negotiate their own TV deals, the NCAA negotiated broadcast controls on behalf of all member institutions. This gave the NCAA significant power over the distribution and economics of televised college sports. Another reason the NCAA centralized television rights was to limit competitive imbalance between the programs. The concern was that wealthier or more popular universities might just dominate television exposure and recruiting also, if allowed to negotiate their own deals. But by controlling the number of televised games and distributing revenue collectively, the NCAA attempted to maintain more of a level playing field between all the schools, the big, the small, the wealthy, the not so wealthy. This early media system was therefore presented not only as a business decision, but also sort of as a regulatory tool designed to protect amateur competition. Then the television contracts began generating some pretty real revenue. In the early years, television rights quickly became a significant financial asset. The paper provides an example of the scale of these early deals. So, for example, the NCAA television agreement in 1960 was worth approximately $3.1 million. That'd be worth between $34 and $36 million today in 2026, which is not insignificant. But by 1966, about 6 years later, the value of those TV deals started to increase to about $7.7 million per season, which puts us at about $77 to $78 million in 2026. Compared to modern sports media deals, these numbers might seem kind of small, but at the time they represented a major new revenue stream for college athletics. This money helped to fund NCAA administrative operations, championship tournaments, and expansion of these athletic programs. Television became one of the first mechanisms, actually, that connected college athletics directly to national media revenue. There was also a cultural implication that started to happen. Television expanded the cultural influence of college athletics because games that once drew large stadium crowds were now reaching millions of viewers across the country. This increased visibility strengthened a lot of different aspects of college sports, especially recruiting power of the successful programs, the national recognition of some of the star athletes. These college athletes were starting to become household names, and alumni engagement with the universities. College football and basketball specifically were increasingly becoming national entertainment events and not just these Saturday night campus activities. This funding model is starting to expose some of the modern systems, like they're really just a lot more visible now. And by the late 1960s, a lot of the key elements of the modern college sports economy were already in place. And these included things like large spectator audience, national media coverage, growing broadcast revenue, and institutional competition for athletic success. But one important feature still distinguished college athletes from professional leagues. The NCAA maintained a really tight centralized control over television rights and broadcast distribution. That control would eventually be challenged, and when it was, the financial structure of college sports was going to change dramatically. The system the NCAA built around television rights was just running along and lasted for decades. But in the early 1980s now, several universities began to challenge the NCAA's authority over broadcasting. that challenge eventually reached as high up as the United States Supreme Court, and the decision that followed would fundamentally reshape the economics of college athletics afterwards. By the late 1970s and 1980s, the NCAA still controlled how college football appeared on television. The NCAA television plan limited things like how many games could be televised, which schools could actually appear, and how broadcast revenue was distributed. The intention was originally to maintain a competitive balance and protect the amateur ideals that were, in theory, still in place. But by the 1980s, major football programs had begun to start seeing the system very differently. Larger programs believed that their games were far more valuable than the NCAA contracts allowed them to capture. Two of the most prominent challengers in this case were the University of Oklahoma and the University of Georgia. These universities, along with the College Football Association, began negotiating their own televised contracts outside of this NCAA structure. The NCAA, of course, was not cool with that. They responded by threatening sanctions. Programs that participated in unauthorized television deals could face penalties like being banned from appearing on television and restrictions on their bowl participation games. The NCAA believed centralized television control was a necessary thing to protect the integrity of the college athletics. But the universities challenging the system saw the NCAA's approach as something else entirely. They argued that the NCAA was effectively acting as a cartel controlling television supply. By 1984, this dispute eventually reached the United States Supreme Court. The case is known as NCAA versus the Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma. The court ruled that the NCAA's television plan violated antitrust law. That essentially means the NCAA had been restricting market competition by controlling which games could be broadcast and by fixing television rights prices. This ruling dramatically weakened the NCAA's ability to centrally control television broadcasting. The immediate impact afterwards, the television market was wide open. Once the NCAA's television control was removed, conferences and individual schools gained the freedom to negotiate their own broadcast deals. This unleashed a massive expansion in college sport broadcasting. More games were televised, networks were competing for rights, conferences began building their own media partnerships. This moment effectively marked the beginning of the modern college sports media economy. The authors describe how commercialization intensified following this shift. Television exposure became one of the most important drivers of athletic department revenue. Programs that could attract large TV audiences gained significant financial advantages. That just kind of makes sense. This created increasing separation between major football and basketball programs and the smaller athletic departments. So just to summarize where we're at so far with that, the NCAA once tightly controlled college sports broadcasting, and then it didn't because major universities challenged that control. The Supreme Court ruled the NCAA's system violated the antitrust law, and then after the ruling, the modern television revenue model exploded. So what exactly does this explosion of this modern television revenue model look like? After the 1984 Supreme Court decision opened up the television market, the commercialization of college athletics just started to accelerate super rapidly. But it wasn't just the television contracts that were driving this growth. A new ecosystem of companies began developing around college athletics, specializing in media rights, corporate sponsorships, branding and licensing, and then the broadcast distribution. These companies helped transform university athletic departments into large-scale sports marketing operations. The article highlights 3 organizations specifically that played a particularly important role in this transformation. One of the earliest companies to shape college sports marketing was called Host Communications Incorporated. Host developed a model that packaged together multiple rights for athletics programs, and these deals would often include broadcast rights, advertising during the games, and sponsorship placement. The company would then sell these packages to corporate partners. One of the innovations Host introduced was this idea of official sponsors. For example, a company might become the official soft drink, or official bank, or official car dealership, or official grocery store of a university's athletic program. These sponsorship deals became highly valuable because they gave companies exclusive branding opportunities tied to these popular college teams. Host later applied the same model to the NCAA men's basketball tournament, helping sell corporate sponsorship rights associated with that event. Another company highlighted in the article is Learfield Communications. Originally a regional broadcasting network, Learfield began acquiring radio rights to university athletic programs. As competition increased with companies like Host Communications, Learfield expanded aggressively. The company began negotiating these bundled media rights, and it included a bunch of different forms of sports communication. And these deals combined things like radio broadcasts with advertising and sponsorship opportunities. Over time, Learfield built relationships with dozens of universities across the country, and they became one of the most powerful intermediaries between universities and the sports media marketplace. The third major company and the third major shift during this era was the monetization of university logos and trademarks. This transformation is closely tied to the creation of the Collegiate Licensing Company, or CLC. CLC was founded by Bill Battle, a former player on Alabama's 1961 national championship team and later a sports agent. Battle realized that universities were losing potential revenue because they had not formally secured ownership over their logos, their slogans, or their trademarks. For example, phrases like Roll Tide could appear on merchandise without generating any revenue for the university. So CLC stepped in and helped universities formally register and protect their trademarks. Once universities controlled those trademarks, they could license them to companies producing the merchandise. This allowed schools to start earning royalties from anything, things like apparel, hats, posters, or memorabilia, you name it. The licensing industry grew rapidly and became a major revenue source for universities, especially with the stronger athletic brands. Into the early 21st century, these developments had reshaped the economic structure of college athletics altogether. This combination of television rights with sponsorship agreements and licensing deals and media partnerships turned major college sports into this large-scale entertainment industry that we know it as today. The article notes that these marketing and media companies dramatically transformed how athletic departments even operated. What had once been primarily campus athletic programs were now connected to a national network of sports media and corporate sponsorships. This expansion also intensified the gap between major programs and smaller institutions that just couldn't compete or just didn't have the brand recognition. Schools with large fan bases and national followings benefited the most, obviously, from these commercial opportunities. So, just to summarize that section, sports marketing companies built a business infrastructure around college athletics. Corporate sponsorships became embedded in university athletic programs. Universities began monetizing logos, trademarks, and their brand identity. And college sports has now evolved into a fully developed commercial entertainment industry. I'm going to insert a bit of an interlude here, and I'm going to call it the nonprofit paradox. This has to do with the official position of universities. Despite the rapid commercialization of college athletics at this time, universities have historically argued that intercollegiate sports are not profit seeking enterprises. Athletic programs exist within the nonprofit educational institutions. In legal arguments surrounding college sports and governance, university organizations emphasize that universities themselves are not commercial entities and that athletics operate within that same educational mission. This argument has historically been a central defense of this continued amateur model. But there's a different reality of the modern system. At the same time, the economic scale of major college sports increasingly made that argument difficult to reconcile with reality. By the early 21st century, television deals, they're in the billions now. Corporate sponsorships surrounded these major programs, and licensing agreements generated massive merchandise revenue. Large Division I football and basketball programs were operating inside a national sports entertainment industry. Courts began recognizing this bit of a sticky contradiction. In a 2015 federal case involving the use of player names and likeness, a judge wrote that college football and basketball had clearly become big business. At the center of the debate was this rather strange paradox. College athletics was presented as amateur educational activities, but many of the surrounding financial structures looked very similar to professional sports. Media companies earn money, sponsors earn money, universities generated revenue and visibility, but the athletes themselves were still restricted from receiving compensation beyond any scholarships. There's another complication, is that many of the programs still somehow lose money. The article highlights this important nuance that even though the industry generated large revenues, that most athletic departments were not profitable. Many of the programs instead relied on student athletic fees and university subsidies and even internal loans. For example, some Division I programs relied heavily on mandatory student fees to support athletic budgets, while others accumulated large internal debts in pursuit of competitive success. So the system simultaneously produced enormous revenue at the top, yet there's so much financial strain across many of the institutions. By the 2010s, the tension reaches something of a breaking point. This contradiction started to become a little bit too difficult to just ignore. College athletics were increasingly operating as this commercial industry, yet the rules governing athlete compensation were still built on the idea that college sports were fundamentally amateur educational activities. I love that term. That tension between commercial reality and amateur tradition would soon move from university policy discussions into the courtroom. By the 2010s, the economic scale of college athletics had become just impossible to ignore. These bigger college football and basketball programs were generating enormous revenue through these huge television contracts, these corporate sponsorships, merchandise licensing, and media partnerships. At the same time, NCAA rules still prohibited athletes from earning any compensation beyond the scholarships. This contradiction began attracting increasing legal scrutiny. Courts and policymakers started asking, if college sports generates billions of dollars in revenue, why is it the athletes themselves are restricted from sharing in that revenue? Case after case started piling up, challenging the NCAA policies related to their athlete compensation. One of the key issues involved the use of athlete names, their images, and their likeness in commercial products and media broadcasts. Athletes were arguing that universities and media companies were earning money using their identities without allowing them to receive any compensation. These lawsuits helped introduce the concept that would later become central to NCAA reform: name, image, and likeness rights, commonly referred to today as NIL. As these cases progressed, courts increasingly acknowledged the economic reality of big-time college athletics. In a 2015 federal case involving the use of athlete likeness in broadcasts, a judge observed that Division I football and basketball had clearly become big business. This recognition weakened the NCAA's traditional argument that college sports were purely amateur educational activities. If the industry functioned economically like a commercial enterprise, then these restrictions on athlete compensation became way more difficult to justify legally. In 2021, there was a turning point, and that came at the Supreme Court with the case NCAA versus Alston. The case focused on NCAA limits placed on certain educational related benefits for athletes. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that these restrictions just straight up violated the antitrust law. The court concluded that the NCAA could not impose certain limits on compensation that was tied to education. Although the case did not directly mandate NIL payments, it significantly weakened the NCAA's legal authority to restrict athlete compensation. That decision triggered some pretty rapid policy change right afterwards, and following that decision, the NCAA faced a lot of growing pressure from several different directions. They faced pressure from the federal courts, from state legislation, from public opinion, from athlete advocacy. Several states had already passed laws allowing college athletes to profit from their name, image, and likeness. So, without a unified national rule, universities risked operating under a patchwork of all these different state laws. The NCAA sort of had to respond here, and they did. And in 2021, they adopted an interim NIL policy, which meant that for the first time, college athletes were allowed to earn compensation through endorsements, through sponsorships, through appearances, and now through social media promotions, since that had become a thing. So now we're in this NIL era, and it's got pretty limited regulation. The introduction of these NIL rights dramatically changed the landscape of college athletics. But the system initially launched with hardly any centralized regulation. As a result, the new actors quickly got into the system, and one of the most significant developments was the emergence of NIL collectives. These are organizations that pooled money from boosters and donors in order to fund NIL deals for their athletes. In many cases, these collectives became closely connected to recruiting. It's not hard to see how quickly these collectives would become really closely tied to recruiting and used as a pretty potent recruiting tool. Programs could now attract the top athletes, not only through scholarships and facilities, but also through, hey, look at these potential NIL earnings. The authors described this early period as something of a Wild West environment, where policies were still evolving and enforcement mechanisms were still pretty unclear. So just a quick summary for that section. The commercial scale of college athletics triggered legal challenges to these amateur compensation rules and the restrictions that followed them. Courts began to recognize that major college sports function economically as big business, and the Alston decision severely weakened NCAA authority over their athlete compensation and those restrictions. So we saw the introduction of NIL rights, and that created a new system where athletes could profit from their identities. This NIL era that we're in represents one of the most dramatic changes in the history of college athletics. It might not be the final stage of reform. In fact, the article argues that the system is probably still evolving, and recent settlements and policy proposals actually suggest that college athletics could soon move toward direct revenue sharing between universities and athletes. If that happens, the line between amateur college sports and professional athletics may become even harder to distinguish. Whew, I just looked at the time. This is going to be a long episode, isn't it? All right, let's wrap this up. Where does this bring us to modern day? After this NCAA versus Alston decision and the introduction of NIL policies in 2021, college athletics entered this new and somewhat uncharted phase. For the first time, athletes could legally earn compensation tied to their name, image, and likeness. This meant that athletes could profit through going to college, through endorsement deals, social media sponsorships, promotional appearances, and personal branding. Although the NIL was framed as this major transformation, the authors caution that it should also be understood as the latest stage in a long historical pattern of compensation and commercialization in college athletics. Another major development discussed in the article is some more NCAA court appearances with the House vs. NCAA settlement. The settlement addresses lawsuits filed by former athletes seeking compensation for past restrictions on their ability to profit from NIL rights. Key elements of this settlement include approximately $2.8 billion in damages for these former athletes and the possibility of direct revenue sharing between universities and athletes. Under proposed frameworks, schools might eventually distribute up to roughly $20 million annually in revenue to their athletes across all their programs. If implemented broadly, this would represent a major shift towards athletes receiving a share of the revenue generated by college sports. A bunch of important questions still remain unsolved. For example, will athletes eventually be classified as employees? How will revenue sharing interact with Title IX requirements? And will all universities be able to afford this new financial model? The authors emphasize that reforms often create new challenges rather than fully resolving existing ones. Throughout the history of college athletics, attempts to regulate or reform the system have often expanded commercialization instead of limiting it. Another issue raised in the article is the growing divide between institutions. These major Division I programs with large fan bases and these huge television audiences generate enormous revenue. But don't forget, there's a lot of these smaller programs that still operate, often at financial deficits. And that raises the possibility that future reforms could even further separate the big commercial athletic programs from the smaller institutions that are still focused primarily on education. In other words, the economic structure of college athletics may continue to evolve into something we've never seen before, maybe even multiple tiers. One of the strongest conclusions from the article is that the NIL era should not be viewed as the beginning of athlete compensation. Instead, the authors argued that compensation and commercialization have actually been present throughout the entire history of college athletics, even if they took different forms in different eras. The NIL era simply makes those economic relationships a lot more visible and formalized, and I would argue lucrative. An NIL deal is significantly more lucrative than someone's college team offering them a job as a custodian in one of the facilities. Remember, for over a century now, college athletics have balanced two competing identities. One is rooted in education and amateur competition, and the other is driven by media, entertainment, and business. This NIL era may feel like a dramatic shift, but when viewed across the history of college sports, it might just be the latest chapter in a long-running struggle and evolution to reconcile these two worlds. That finally does it for this week's episode. New episodes are still going to drop every Thursday morning at 6 a.m. Mountain Standard Time on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to reach out, links to any social media that I use will be posted in the description. If you'd like to support the show, which is currently a one-man operation, you can do so by heading over to patreon.com/Coretex Athletic Review. My name is Evan Carrillo. This is the Coretex Athletic Review. Thank you very much for listening, and stay out of your own way.